In October, people started talking about Sega coming out with a miniature plug-and-play version of the Dreamcast.
Some people were reporting on this like it was confirmed, legit actually going to happen.
They are mistaken.
The story goes back to an October interview in Famitsu Magazine with Yosuke Okunari. Famitsu Magazine is basically the big gaming publication in Japan, and it is very influential. Did you know they've given less than 30 perfect review scores for games in over 30 years? For instance, they recently gave a perfect score to Death Stranding for the PlayStation 4. What?
Okay, so Famitsu isn't what it once was, but suffice it to say, it used to be really important.
Yosuke Okunari, on the other hand, is one of the biggest executives at Sega, a survivor of a recent company purge, and an old-school Sega mainstay who has creative roots going all the way back to the days of the Saturn. The occasion for this interview was the launch of the new Game Gear Micro, and so the conversation moved on to what's next for Sega. Yosuke Okunari confirmed that Sega has definitive plans to do yet another retro mini console, but that such a console wouldn't be here for like 2 years. He also indicated that the next retro mini console could be anything that people have been talking about, everything from the SG-1000 on down to the Sega Dreamcast. And he also said that whatever it is they produce next, that it will be with the international market in mind and not just Japan. Verbatim, he said, "The project will be much bigger as we gaze upon the world."
Now this has led a lot of people to assume that Sega is going with the Dreamcast. The reason for this is that Yosuke Okunari mentioned 2 specific consoles by name. He said SG-1000, and he said Sega Dreamcast.
The greatest video game console ever made.
Whoa, not so fast, Kimosabi. He mentioned the Sega Dreamcast. He didn't say it was going to be the Sega Dreamcast.
What he literally said is that it could be anything, including the SG-1000 or the Sega Dreamcast.
In other words, it could be anything, from Sega's first console going on down to the very last. He didn't necessarily mean that it was going to be either of those choices.
And he further clarified that whatever it was, that it was going to have a global audience in mind this time around, which honestly completely precludes the SG-1000, which only came out in a few countries like Australia and Japan.
What's the SG-1000, you say?
The SG-1000 released in July of 1984, selling over 100,000 units worldwide. Unleashing over 70 mega powerful games that featured 16 different possible colors at an eye-destroying 256 by 192 super pixel resolution, 1,000 bytes of RAM, and finally you could play Congo Bongo at home.
Whoa, stop. It's definitely not going to be the SG-1000.
No one has heard of the SG-1000. It has the graphical power of a freaking ColecoVision. No one wants that. No one.
But it's not going to be the Dreamcast either. Let's break it down.
First of all, the Dreamcast is nothing like emulating a Sega Genesis or a Game Gear. It is technically old hardware, but it's far more sophisticated than the consoles of the early 90s. And it utilized a proprietary disc format known as GD-ROM that could hold nearly twice as much data as a regular CD. This means that a Sega Dreamcast Mini would have to be relatively expensive by necessity. It would probably have to use hardware similar to the $100 PlayStation Classic, which is built upon an SoC chip with a MediaTek ARM processor, the kind used in some cheaper tablet computers. And like the PlayStation Classic, there would also need to be a fairly large flash storage device to make a Dreamcast Mini actually possible. The PlayStation Classic was able to fit 20 games on a 16 gig flash storage device. But while some Dreamcast games like Crazy Taxi are fairly small in size, some games like Shenmue or Skies of Arcadia can take up more than an entire gig just by themselves. Even Sonic Adventure is nearly 1 gig in size. Therefore, a Dreamcast Mini would either have to settle for a very small library of games, or boost the cost even further by including a much larger flash memory device. Further, unlike the Genesis Mini or the PlayStation Classic, the Dreamcast came with not 2, but 4 controller ports. That means you'd have to increase the cost even further, in order to double the number of USB controller ports. That's not likely to cost too much money, but it's just adding fuel on top of a money-burning fire.
If the failure of the PlayStation Classic has taught us anything, it's that you don't want to charge $100 for a plug-and-play console, and you don't want to screw up when it comes to the emulation either.
The Dreamcast can be emulated, and fairly well, but it's one thing to get Sonic Adventure up and running for free with just a few glitches and unexpected game crashes. It's an entirely different thing to sell consumers anything other than a fully functional product that's representative of the actual real-life Sega Dreamcast, and I have yet to see evidence that this is actually possible. I think making this a reality would require a lot of extra time and effort on the part of Sega, and once again, that's just going to increase the cost of an already costly product.
But do you know what else costs way too much?
The Sega Dreamcast Controller. In 1999, the Dreamcast Controller was polarizing. I personally loved it, but many other people were put off by the massive size and lack of a second analog stick. It was unique, with not one but two analog trigger buttons, and an old-fashioned D-pad in case you needed it. It had a cool Future World 2000 look, but what really made the controller unique was its Visual Memory Unit, or the VMU. It was a really cool idea, a memory card with a tiny LCD screen that could double as a kind of Tamagotchi, with a bunch of different uses depending upon which games you had. It even had a tiny little D-pad and two action buttons itself, making it more like a miniature video game console within a video game console. The big problem was that they could only store about 100 kilobytes of data, and so their application outside of saving game progress was fairly limited. Also, they had a limited battery life. However, some key Dreamcast games made heavy use of their functionality. Skies of Arcadia even had an entire side quest based upon the device that had to be cut completely from the GameCube version of the game. If the Dreamcast Mini were ever to actually exist, then it would have to somehow include not only a massive wacky Dreamcast controller, but the VMU that plugged into it, and that's a very costly prospect. Back in the day, the actual Dreamcast controller was like $30 just by itself. The VMU was an additional $20. This means we're looking at a USB controller that would be expensive, especially if it's true to the original, with its two analog triggers and all of that stuff. In fact, third-party Dreamcast controllers today cost well over $50, and that's without the VMU included. The VMU means that Sega is going to have to pay to manufacture not just a mini console and the controllers, but all of the VMUs to go with them.
But that's not all.
The Dreamcast wasn't just known for its wacky controller and badass memory card. It was also the first home console to really make good use of online gaming and heavy use of the internet. Along with essential games like Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi, Skies of Arcadia, and Jet Set Radio, there was both Phantasy Star Online and Phantasy Star Online 2.0. A couple of 3D dungeon crawlers that let you interact with friends and battle monsters in real time over the internet. With a freaking keyboard! To say that these games are important to Dreamcast fans would be an understatement. People forged lifelong friendships, and even met their spouses through these games.
Yet if a hypothetical Dreamcast Mini ever launched, you and I both know these games aren't happening.
Because the official North American servers for Phantasy Star Online were shut down in 2003. The Japanese Xbox servers were shut down in 2007. There are still private servers operated by dedicated fans who play this game on the original hardware, but do you really think SEGA-Sammy is going to be interested in participating in that? Phantasy Star Online would require both additional hardware and the creation and maintenance of an official server to host the game. That means higher cost to Sega, and that in turn means higher cost to consumers. And like I keep saying, that's just adding yet even more fuel on top of a money-burning pile.
And here's the thing, Phantasy Star Online isn't optional. It was vital to the Dreamcast's identity as a console. Dropping it is not trivial. It's about as bad as dropping Sonic 3 from the Sega Genesis Mini.
You can't do a Dreamcast Mini without Phantasy Star Online, but you also can't do a Dreamcast Mini with Phantasy Star Online.
It's just not worth it. A Dreamcast Mini would cost too much, probably well in excess of $100. possibly without even including a second controller or a VMU. And that's likely far more than the consumer is willing to pay. And it would only be able to offer a small library of games without access to the full online potential. And most likely without the benefit of the kind of close enough to flawless emulation that's required by the fans of these games. There is no way that Sega could realistically turn a Dreamcast into a successful plug-and-play product. Not a good one. But what then? What is Sega going to do for their next plug-and-play mini console? After all, Yosuke Okunari himself has plainly stated that they're going to do just that. Well, let's think back to what Mr. Okunari said during that interview. He said something that I think gives the whole thing away. He said plainly that the next project would be with an international market in mind, as opposed to merely a Japanese one.
The Sega Dreamcast sold around 10 million units worldwide, but the Sega Master System has sold between 10 and 13 million units. And the console was for years the dominant video game console of both Europe and Brazil. Unlike the Dreamcast, the Master System CPU is an 8-bit Zilog Z80 processor running at 4 MHz, a very common microprocessor that has its origins in the 1970s. And so unlike the Dreamcast, emulating Master System games is really no problem. Master System games were held on ROM cartridges, and even the largest games, such as the incredible Phantasy Star, were only a few hundred kilobytes in size. Therefore, it would be possible to pack in a very large number of games without having to include a very large flash memory device. This would not only greatly lower the unit cost of a Master System, but a larger library of games would generate the perception of value to potential customers. Further, the Master System controller is simple and straightforward. A directional button and 2 action buttons. In fact, it's a little too simple and straightforward. There's no start button or pause button on the controller. However, there was also never an expensive VMU memory system or a modem, and the challenge of internet connectivity. The Sega Master System is about as straightforward as they get, and the very best games in its library are pretty much all within the realm of Sega's intellectual property.
If Sega releases another miniature retro plug-and-play console, then I'm calling it right here. It's going to be a Sega Master System Mini. It was popular with international gamers in the 80s and 90s. It would be extremely cheap to make, and therefore it would garner a competitive price tag. It has a simple controller, it has a solid library of first-party games, and it's already sort of been worked on. Sega just released the Game Gear Micro in Japan with the help of M2, and if you know anything about the Game Gear, then you probably already know that it's basically just a portable Master System. My guess is that Sega, feeling comfortable with how the Game Gear was emulated on the Game Gear Micro, might think that a Master System is the next logical step. If you can get Power Strike to work on a Game Gear Micro, then you've already completed all the work needed to get Power Strike to work on a Master System Mini, and that just saves everyone time and money. Mr. Okunari said that whatever it is they're planning, it won't be around anytime soon. Probably not until 2022. But you know what 2022 is? The 35th anniversary of the launch of the Sega Master System in Europe. That can't be a coincidence. I love the Dreamcast. It's my favorite game console of all time. But the truth is, there's no way Sega is going to be able to produce a mini Dreamcast that does the console justice while also maintaining an affordable cost. But that doesn't mean the Dreamcast library is dead. Dreamcast games continue to get published on platforms like Steam and iOS. And I think there's good reason to think that Sega's gonna want in on some of that 3D All-Stars action as well. Even Phantasy Star Online is getting a new entry in 2021 for the Xbox and PC. It's not like these games are gone or anything like that. It's just that they're available in new and evolving ways. Except Skies of Arcadia. That game seriously needs both a remaster and a sequel. But even somehow that's been in the news lately. So, what do you all think? Is Sega really going to make a Dreamcast Mini? What do you think of my hypothesis that it's actually going to be a Master System Mini? Please let us know in the comments, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Bye now.